Going live. Soon as they go live. I do not have permission to live stream. Why is that?
Admin, so I don't know what's going on.
Let me try this again. Should be doable.
We're already live streaming.
Oh, it says recording.
Well, yeah. But that's me recording on my computer.
Oh, I see.
Going live. Aha, there it is. Let me just double check to see if it goes. Yep, okay. Hello to the 5 people who are on time. Hello, welcome to our May jobs report and inflation update. I am your host, Colin Moe from Albert's List, and joining us is Dr. Riley White, professor of finance from the University of New Mexico. Today, we're going to cover the CPI inflation update, jobs reports, and what a US default would actually look like. Please drop your questions in the Q&A or chat, wherever you want. We'll definitely address them when we get to them, and off and away we go. To you, Dr. White.
Thank you so much, Colin. Welcome, members of the Albert's List community. Thank you all for being here today. I am very thrilled to come speak with you. I know Tuesday is not the ideal night. We were talking about nights that could work. I've got all these other shenanigans the rest of the week, and we're like, let's try Tuesday. And Tuesday is the worst night ever for everyone. But I want to thank you for making the time, especially a couple of people who may have been here before. It is an honor always to see you. And as always, ask your questions. No such thing as a silly one. Ask it right there in the chat window, and we can rock and roll from there. We're going to cover a lot of stuff today. So I'm going to share my little presentation here. We're going to go over not only the jobs report and some information about inflation. I go into a little bit of a deep dive into sort of the situation as it stands with the real estate market. And then we're also going to talk about the hypothetical. We just did a dance with the debt ceiling last month that gave everybody a very small heart attack, as it does every couple of years. In this particular scenario, let's actually talk through some of those missing realities behind the debt ceiling. And one of the reasons that we should, one of that as an artifact, raise it when we can, but it is a noble thing to pursue fiscal responsibility in the long run. So we'll talk a little bit about that as well. So, hey, we got Aaron on board. Now we can begin. Finally, thanks, Aaron. I appreciate your back. This is good. Aaron always asks some really stellar questions, too. So let's go over our May 2023 jobs report and summary. So you've seen the news on this. People are like, this is great, but wait, maybe it's not so great. And depending on how many news articles you've read or the nuanced levels of what new articles you read, you probably got a little bit of confused in deciding, is this a good report or a bad one? So let's break it on down. In the jobs report, we exceeded our expectations. We added about 339,000 jobs. That's about 200K over where we thought we'd be. Yay, sunshine, rainbows, unicorns. The problem is unemployment also rose to 3.7%. And that's a 0.3% rise. It's significant. So the question is why did this happen? And the answer is that when we talk about unemployment data, we're talking about two separate surveys. One is payroll data that the companies fill in. How many people have a job? And they go, yes, you all have a job. And then it's household data. Let's ask people if they have a job. And the people are like, yes, I have a job, or I don't have a job. Then they combine them and you look at the difference between these reports and you get some really weird numbers. So on the jobs number overall, in a payroll report, for instance, one of the reasons that you can be a little skewed, and both of them can be skewy in a couple of reasons, but a payroll report can be skewed a little bit because if somebody changes jobs during the period of the survey, they might be counted twice in that same situation. Is it the Albert's List effect? There are people changing jobs so rapidly that this is creating an artificially high number or appearance of job creation. Maybe, maybe not. Unemployment, on the other hand, is it based on the question of people entering the labor force en masse that weren't there before? And it's not really so much that case, because one of the things about unemployment is it looks at the number of people who are either employed or looking for a job divided by the size of the workforce. And you have to be looking for a job, even if you don't have one, to be included in the unemployment rate. But that's really also not part of the picture. It's a very noisy estimate. I actually expect this value to be revised in a very significant way in coming months once the other additional economic data that passes through the system gets resolved and they do some changes on this. And I suspect it might be revised downward to be a little bit more fair, but I still think overall it's pretty good. Now, at the end of the day, is it a positive jobs report? Yes. Where did we add jobs when we found them? We added about 64,000 in professional and business services. That's really good. 48,000 in leisure and hospitality. Again, hit hard by the pandemic, coming back still. It's out there right in time for the summer season. And encouragingly, about 25,000 in construction, despite the headwinds we have across the real estate market, not only for the residential mortgages and the cost of new construction, but also things like commercial real estate and the concerns that a lot of people have around that. It's nice to see positive numbers in construction. Labor force participation. This goes back to that thing. Are we bringing more people back into the market? Not really. Our participation rate is steady at about 62.6%. People who are retired are staying retired. And normally we'd see in a particularly strong job market with a lot of incentives for people to go out and get jobs, some of those people coming back in and maybe taking something. Average hourly earnings on the other side, those rose about 11 cents. To give you a sense, this caps off over the last 12 months, about a 4% annual wage increase. That is okay. Now, some people, like I've read different takes across the board about this. One of the things is, oh, that's fun. Thanks for, look at this. I love Aaron's plain sight. He's doing the jolt side over here and I love it. And we'll talk about that too. I love it. Aaron has some good links. And they're legit, I promise. But excuse me, I just did a jog. Every time I jog, I'm like, I better go for a run. I cough. So it's a bad habit. So I'm like, I'll do this right before I give an hour and a half long talk. So anyway, hourly earnings rose 11 cents. That was pretty good. That's about a 4% wage growth. Is that enough to power long-term inflation? Maybe. I would say with inflation still 4% and above, no. I would say right now it isn't the type of wage growth that we're particularly worried about in a certain sense. Some people are looking at it in that sense, but I'm looking at also and saying, well, 11 cents on 33 bucks, doing the math on that isn't so much that it's going to throw us offline and power long-term inflation. Wage growth is always it sounds weird. We want some wage growth that's higher than inflation, but we don't want wage growth to be so high that it then powers additional inflation down the line. So the Fed is really tricky about that. Now, the other thing when we think about this is look at the question of, let's talk about the people who are unemployed right now. And permanent layoffs are now a higher percentage of unemployed than they were before, up to about 49% in May. They were about 40% in the previous months. Household reports job losses, employers report job gains. What's going on here? And one of the solutions to this difference is we look at the number of people who indicate that they're self-employed. The number of people who are self-employed are down about 369,000. And that's a bit of an interesting thing. And it could be just an artifact of the survey to appear this way. Is it become a more difficult market to maintain your own business in this market or to maintain your level of self-employment? Because we're not really seeing this. And this is noisy data. It's noisy, trendy, and you have a bunch of red signals and a bunch of green signals, and it's going to be really interesting. And this is really good. And a note also, Aaron puts out on Jolt. May data for Jolt is actually going to be out July 6th. Jolt is always a full month behind, important to note. So look across the board, across different sectors, here's what happened. Education and health services did well. Overall, education is a strong market, but health services in particular have been just a robust hiring market. Health services, incidentally, also do well in recessionary periods. Professional and business services. I was worried about this sector. I'm worried about this sector in the long run because as companies start looking at their bottom lines, they often cut back on the extraneous expenses associated with professional services. But we've added 64,000 jobs here. That means money is flowing. There's stuff happening. That is good. Government jobs are up too. Financial activities, they're kind of lagging, mining and logging. So if you're out there doing the Alberts List, doing the coal mining side of Alberts List, it has been a rough market. Utilities have been flat, interesting enough. Manufacturing, and of course, everybody's favorite sector, the information sector, is still negative. And we see that on local data when we dial down into San Jose and San Francisco, which we'll do later on. So let's talk a little bit more about these shenanigans. Let's look at the job growth by industry. This is the ADP report for May, and often the ADP, while a different survey, presented some other interesting data that is worth looking at. Leisure and hospitality jobs, a jump 208,000 in the month between April and May there, pretty good. But notice the following trend between both of these things. Job gains are occurring in low-paying industries. Mining, construction, trade, other services, leisure and hospitality. Job losses are occurring in higher pay industries, financial activities, education, professional services. Manufacturing, you can argue it either way. Sometimes manufacturing employment can be pretty good. So the hard part is overall, it's a mixed bag when we think about this. And is this a long-term trend to be aware of? It is true, as you've noticed, that some of the higher paying jobs, and indeed the composite portion of the questions I've received across Albert's list, looking at people who are degreed or credentialed often in some way, looking at occupations, have found that, hey, this has been a good time, but sometimes it doesn't feel like the market is really out there. And it doesn't feel like we're having a good time here. And so this is one of the things that we have to consider is, are we seeing sort of a structural shift in these jobs in a way? And why aren't people hiring higher paid jobs? And some of it is due to natural aspects of our market where we're looking at traditionally lower paying jobs like construction suffering still from labor shortages. Other aspects, demand is high in these categories. We're still dealing with pandemic era issues. Some of them are a little bit more nefarious. And so I'm looking at the long term and saying, it's never necessarily a wonderful thing to see high paying jobs being lost in any capacity, or at least in a mixed capacity like this. So ADP, different jobs report than what we typically talk about in the payroll and survey, but it is still a useful jobs indicator. So coming on down, of course, and again, keep applying the questions right into the chat window. I'm happy to go over anything again. If you've got any questions, anything I can talk about. Oh, look at this. Boom goes the dynamite. I see somebody was crafting Aaron was crafting the world's longest question. That's good. Thank you, Aaron. I knew something was processing there. So we should not forget that 2 out of 3 separations are quits. Only 1 out of 3 are discharges. I got more information on quits. We're going to talk about that soon. Separations increase and those kind of things. I'll talk to you more about this in a second, too. So we'll talk about this. So initial jobless claims. What do we know about this? We have a 4-week moving average. That's the blue line. This is the continuing jobless claim. So overall, end of last year, we just went all the way downhill with continuing jobless claims, a good sign that the job market was improving and humming along well. Since September, we've been on a continuous jobless claims level on an increase. This has leveled out somewhat in the last couple months, but it still remains higher than it was at the end of last year. And that's interesting to know. Aaron brought up job openings and quit rates. So Aaron says, wait a second here. Look, a solid third of these things are quits. They're not people being fired. But of course, we look at the broad question and say, why are people quitting? Are people quitting more or less often than before? And the quit rate reached its apex about a year ago when about 3% of all workers in a given month would quit. Right now, it's down to about 2.5%. So it shows, and many people, from an economics perspective, you look at this, it seems that quits are a sign of confidence in the job market. You quit your job because you're confident in something, your own fiscal position, your ability to get another job, something is happening in a positive light, perhaps. Or maybe it is this, there's a certain level, and I'm going to put the people who have the righteous FU previous job over there for a second, because I see you, I acknowledge you, and you're also important just to burn, to watch the world burn. But the quit rate is actually declining. That is an indicator that, wait a second, maybe people perhaps are getting a little bit more concerned about future prospects. Now, is this justified or not? Job openings, of course, have been ridiculously high. We know that the number of job openings has exceeded the number of actual unemployed people by a factor of 2 almost. Now it's about 1.8 or so. We look at the total number of unemployed, total number of job openings. Now, the question is, of course, how can this possibly be? When you look at this, you say, wait a second, Riley, how can I have a lower number of unemployed people than job openings? The question is mismatch in skills asked and skills demanded. And when you have these things, it's easy to say, hey, wait a second, I have a large number of leisure and hospitality job openings. But if you don't have those degrees, if you're an engineer who's unemployed, you're not going to be looking first at those jobs. You'll be looking at jobs in your sector and in your area. And likewise for things like plumbers or things like electricians or things like construction workers or finance professors, any other manner of folk. You end up in a situation where you will operate within your skill set. So there is a mismatch in the skill set. I look at this and the solution would be, hey, let's think about redoing some of our H-2B visa scenarios to make it a little bit more easier. Let's hire people where we have shortages. and think about the market being more globally as a solution, but there's not a lot of traction there that seems to unite both parties in their opposition. But that's the best part about being in economics and finance, is you can make neutral statements that often have other negative side effects for many people down the line as they perceive them. So openings exceed quits, but quit rates are going down. Openings are also going down. Aaron also points out the velocity of quits was extremely high, very unsustainable over a couple of years. It's a more normal rate now. That's true. And Aaron, you're right. It is close to kind of our longer term average. Certainly looks like where we were back in the first decade of the 21st century. I know, like, what decade? First decade of the 21st century, back in the 2000s, back in the aughts. It's a more normal right now, independent of the sky falling. The recession still hasn't hit. Absolutely right. And we're going to talk about that. Will it hit? Will it? Do I have to care about it hitting? Is it hitting now? Is it going to hit when I'm not looking? We'll talk about that. And there's a few reasons that we'll weigh this. And I'm always interested in your perspective too, as well as anyone who might be on the call. So let's look at the inflation report right now. Okay, so boom goes the dynamite. Last month it was 4.9%. Now it's 4% annually. Yay, 4%. Not only are we we're tangibly close to a number that might actually be okay. And actually, if we look at sort of the pre-pandemic economic discourse, we're right in that comfortable range. We're outside of where the Fed is comfortable. The Fed is targeting a 2% inflation rate, but many economists across the board, right wing, left wing, middle wing, no wing, economists often have hypothesized that, say, an inflation rate of 3 to 5% might actually be good for a debt-laden economy, only because it helps inflate away some of that debt. We'll get into a bit about debt in a second. So the idea being, of course, is when inflation is a little bit higher, but not too much higher, that makes debt in the long run that's fixed in nature more affordable. And it's a really good question. So Colin says, target is 2%. We hit it in 3 months. USA #1. So that's a good, I love the optimism, Colin. That's what we're about, even if it's sarcastic. Will we hit 2%? You know, I am still operating by, I think, the best situation in a non-recessionary environment from the Cleveland Fed is that we hit it sometime in 2025. And you're like, wait a second, we can hit this thing in 3 months if we just keep the, and there's reasons to believe we might get at least a little closer to that number, as we'll talk about. Because when we think about inflation, we know it's not just one number. We have overall inflation over the last 12 months being like 4%. Now, we have other things like core inflation. So core inflation, taking out some volatile energy, volatile food, other things, you end up with something like a 5.3% inflation. That's been kind of stuck there. You have core with private new rent indices for shelter. That's actually down to 3%. And this is because one of the things that incorporated in inflation are those run-ups that we had across the board in rents, in home prices. Shelters, the biggest single denominator, the biggest single expense in the CPI report as a factor in it, as a percentage of the weighting. And what that means is because all those shelter costs that we observed last year are going through the system now, and they're a backwards, so it's a past-looking indicator. It's a backwards-looking indicator. In some of those high shelter rates are going to come off in the next couple of months. So Colin, one of those things that Colin's pointing out is, well, wait a second, you know, could we go down to 2%? Core with private new rent indices for shelter. We take out shelter and use a little better and use new rents instead of old shelter. We're already down to 3.1%. Yay, that sounds really good. Core excluding shelter and used cars, 4%. Core services excluding shelter, 4.6%. Interesting stuff. So we're getting close, and we're getting tangibly close. Aaron points out, I think it's at least 1 to 2 years to hit 2% if you want 90 days. Raise rates 10 pips a day for 90 days in a row, you'll get a recession. But man, wouldn't that be a ride? Colin says, also for those that may not remember, can you explain what core means? Yes, of course. So when we think about core, there's one of the two things that we look at in inflation, and I want to exchange this apart. We have an overall CPI, that's Consumer Price Index. That's a representative basket of goods that represent, say, what a household might purchase in any given time of the year. And what core is it takes that same inflation number, but it takes out things that are volatile, 2 things in particular. Energy puts it aside, food puts it aside, and then you're left with what we have as core. And core is that fundamental thing that we know energy can go up and down in a given month. We know that food prices go up and down because they're heavily related to energy, as it turns out, aka distribution costs. So taking out those things that are prone to energy, we're left with core. And the Fed even has a little bit of a more precise measure called super core, where they actually take out shelter because it's past looking and looking at things that are focused heavily on what's left. And for them, it's service sector inflation, which is very hard to beat. So are we getting that soft landing then, Albert says? Well, man, we're getting a landing for sure. We're coming down. We're coming down. We're going to see what happens. We're going to check out those. We're going to check out those earnings numbers for companies. But man, you'll notice that Twitter is vibrant with hopes and dreams of people looking at the question. And then Cullen, landing in a field of cactus is soft compared to landing in the Grand Canyon, I suppose. That's true. And I'm speaking as a professor who resides in New Mexico. We have nothing but cactus and canyons.
I kind of wanted to ask, so if inflation is down, but super core inflation is up, what does that actually mean?
So inflation's down and super core is up. What does that mean? So super core, so one of the drags to our inflation, remember we look at regular inflation. Inflation includes things like energy. Energy costs actually dropped in the last month, believe it or not. As much as we're all like, ha, ha, I really felt that. They dropped overall about 12%, including a 20% drop in gas prices. And one of those things, I'm so Breaking Bad one of these days, Dr. White. I am Dr. White, that's great. That's one of those things. If only my name was Walter. Back to Colin's point, because there's an energy drag that's driving our overall inflation level low, we're going to take out that energy. And if we take out energy is such a big focus of what people spend. When we omit energy, we're still left with supercore, and supercore went down from 5.4 to like 5.3-ish, and core went down from 5.4 to 5.3, 5.3, 5.2-ish. And that means that, and a lot of that's due to that energy differential, to your point. Food inflation also slowed down. The other thing that makes the difference between core and regular inflation, food inflation was about 1% higher, about 7.7. Now it's 6.7, down 11.7 in energy. Medical services also dropped 0.1%. So a relief in the short run. Aaron, with a good link here, this is the CPI index across the board. You can see how much energy was a drag on the overall inflation. So in this case, I'm looking at this being it was a positive. It's like a bank error in your favor. Nobody can really predict energy prices. But because energy prices, which normally have a run up as we approach Memorial Day, that didn't materialize the same way that we saw those high energy prices we see in summer. So right now we're looking at an 11.7% decline. Energy is a global commodity, often out of the purview of something like the Fed to control. Good questions, Colin. Oh yeah, motor vehicle maintenance. Car repairs were way up. That's right. Aaron's right. Car repairs were way up, extraordinarily up. So if your car broke down this month, I'm so sorry. It's been a rough time. Just relax, take a second, ask for those things. Somebody says you need new tires, just get 3. People can live on 3 tires. That's what I try to haggle every time I'm at like Meineke, and it doesn't work. One day. So let's look at this. So another thing, because we're hitting the CPI hard today. These are 2 charts from Jason Furman, great guy to follow if you're looking on things to follow on Twitter and other places. He comes out with a lot of charts, other things, you can read this stuff, but I like the charts he has. So he points out a couple things, and this will lead us into the question about, let's talk about shelter. So when you think about core CPI inflation, so that's that core level. We look at those things that excludes things like energy and food. Now let's go exclude shelter and used vehicles. So we're looking at a thing that the Fed might be interested in. Don't sell your used car, keep them. I can support that, Aaron. I've got almost 200,000 miles on my vehicle. Eventually, it'll catch fire somewhere in the middle of the desert. But until that time, I'm going to ride this thing deeply into the ground. I was looking at this CPI. When we think about inflation excluding shelter and used vehicles, this is a better measure of sort of what the Fed is getting at by controlling inflation. Notice that in the 1 month, that's the blue line changes, and the 3 month, which is that smooth orange line, both are strongly downward, have a strong downward trajectory over the last few months. That's very strong. So core CPI seems to be, in general, despite its relatively high number, more or less out of control. Shelters in control, rather. Shelter CPI inflation. Notice that we had that big buildup. We had first, at the beginning of the pandemic, increases across the board because rates were really low. Increases in home prices. Then that turned into increases in rental prices as rates started coming up, and also as those prices became unaffordable for many, people looked and were competitive in the rental market. Rental prices went up as well. Shelter overall shot through the roof. That has since come down, not because we're necessarily seeing it all the time and uniformly in things like house prices, but it is coming down in a positive way. That is good news for our inflation numbers going forward. What that means is that that shelter data will come in, those lower increased costs will go through the system. We'll start seeing lower inflation on this side. Unknowns are energy. Energy could still shoot up again. Other things, car market, looking at used cars, new cars, that's been very variable, and there's been all kinds of reasons why used car inventories have been what they are, but it's a positive sign overall. And if I were gauging this, looking at that, it will take us a long time to get down to 2%. Right now, we're in a position that says, hey, once some of this shelter data comes off, we'll be in a little bit better position, and I expect us to be comfortably in the 3s next time we talk, I hope, maybe upper 3s. But I could be wrong, and energy always makes a fool of a good financial prediction. Look at this. He's got a 230,000 miles on a 2007 Camry, 65 on a RAV4. Good. I like it. Our market is a train wreck for at least another 2 years, including electric vehicles. And I think that's probably a good assessment. It's going to be rough. I know eventually my car will die, and at such point I will have to get a new one. But I'm hoping it happens at an optimal fiscal position and I can get a good deal, because right now it's unpleasant looking at inventories in particular. And we're going to see a lot of 4th of July travel. That's true. A lot of this is happening right now. You saw an increase, of course, across the board. Travel prices, you booking those trips, international trips. I've got an international trip coming up in 2 weeks to a conference in the UK. And I am, and it's far more money than I would have hoped to have spent on this. And it is sort of a phenomenon of this summer. We've had robust demand across the board for travel, and that's been interesting. But it's, your mileage may vary, so to speak, involving other things. So looking at some more localized data, lodgers tax and other examples that are taken from cities, a bunch of cities, this year didn't shape up as optimistically as we hoped it would be. So although the travel is still here, we're still looking at some vacancies across the board in some luxury markets. And then going down the board, we're looking at some greater stress on, I think, those Airbnb, those short-term type rentals, looking at those situations and passing through the system. The growth rate we saw there is fizzling out in some ways, both due to greater competition and higher prices. So some of those things might pass through the system in an interesting way, but that'll be a really, really interesting couple of years in this market. Didn't the Saudis say they were cutting production again too? I know, we're looking at this. And one of the things we're watching is that price of oil, which of course, when we think of the price of oil, we talk about two big numbers. One is called the West Texas Intermediate, and that is the price of oil as determined in Cushing, Oklahoma, where because of its location at the mixture of a bunch of different pipelines, what they do is they give you a good estimate of what oil prices are trading in North America. Internationally, they more often use Brent as their prices. But right now, oil prices are around $69 a barrel. They will be probably a little bit, I think, in projecting this forward, most likely scenario, if we don't have a recession in the next 6 months, or if we are able to hold it off, you're going to see oil prices remain, I think, overall between 65 and 80. But one of the things that's really unpredictable is energy costs, because a single thing, unanticipated geopolitical consequence, other things happen all the time that could send oil prices soaring. Likewise, recessionary prices can send oil prices dropping. Summer travel is exploding everywhere. This will drive huge summer demand for employment and pricing. Agreed. And I think, Aaron, to that point, that's why, because of these demands and reservations ahead, we're seeing a robust leisure and hospitality market that hopefully will continue. So this is an interesting blast, and we're going to figure out, can the consumers power this indefinitely? Will we see? I don't know. Thank you all for showing up, by the way. I've got a few more people on board. Thank you so much for coming on board. If you've got questions, answer them in the chat window. I love to see them. You can fit them in there. I'll try to read everything. And if I miss something, Colin and Albert usually pick up on it. I know I've had this big thing. Deloitte's got a good thing on summer travel. They're absolutely right. Give me shelter. So one of the reasons that shelter will start falling off those CPI reports is, look at the question. We look at the growth of rents over the last year, still high. Look at the growth of new rents on the ground right now. They have been falling for the last year and a half. And the new lease asking rents, the percentage change from a year earlier, not falling, I should say, but declining in their increase. That give a very different estimate. And I fell for the old adage. They increased at an 18% level in early 2022. In a couple of the markets, well, actually one market, Redfin already estimates they're below water. Most of them are approaching flat. I think this will continue as we sort of shake out the rental market. So across the board, looking at the big determinants, the big providers of data that possess and look at listing data from Zillow all the way down to Redfin, those rates are going down. And that's very positive when we think about how this will drop off CPI. Now, one of the things to think about, one of the things that'll power us in the long run, I put this in the wrong section. I'm going to move this slightly further down a little bit because I got more to talk about there. Let's talk a little bit about home prices. Home prices overall. So one of the things, another leading into the shelter question is, beginning of the recession, mortgage rates, very, very low. Many of us were able to score very low mortgages early on, sunshine. It's great. Look at these payments. Aren't they awesome? Please apply. You can pry my low interest rate mortgage out of my dead hands at some point in the future, because I won't, no matter how many banks send me offers for finance. But one of the issues that people look at in this is we knew that increased the demand for homes having very, very historically low mortgage rates. Again, the average mortgage rate in January of 2021 was 2.65%, incredibly low. And since that time, we're now near 7, and we've been dashing around the 7% level for the 30-year mortgage. That reduces your purchasing power for a house substantially. But, we've noticed that price changes that have happened in these real estate markets haven't happened the same way. And why not? People who have these cheap mortgages, which are most people who have a home, don't want to buy. They're trapped in the home they are. They don't want to go and sell their home and then refinance for a greater mortgage. The entire country is playing a waiting game around this question. We saw the price increase drastically in 2020 to 2021. Prices started increasing, rents followed, of course. People became priced out of the market, increasing demand for rents. Rental increases have also soared across the board. Fundamental determinants of real estate is supply and demand at the end of the day. And there's a few reasons into this. How many homes do you have available and other things? And what about new real estate? You have to look at construction costs, availability of labor. You have to look at zoning. You have to look at a whole bunch of things that factor in as, can I build things a certain way? And we know overall, since at least the Great Recession of 2008, relative to the number of new households created, we've underbuilt. And what do I mean by that? So we've, one measure of, looking at this is we formed about 4 million more households, about 3.8 million more households since the 2008 financial crisis than we actually built homes for to accommodate. And because of that, that means that more people are fighting over the existing real estate that's at hand. And this is a really interesting thing. And then you have a whole another question, which is, what about the second home market? How many of those were that second home boom, other things, when people are fighting over one home? And this is a really contested thing, particularly if we look at a few big issues about this. About 2/3 of we have a home ownership rate across the country of about 65%-ish. If you look in certain areas in San Francisco, in the city, it's more like 50%, given the prohibitive costs and the nature of the real estate makeup in the city of San Francisco. But other parts of the country, it's more like 75. But overall, across the country, it's about 65 on average. And of that, if we look at where people maintain their wealth, about 2/3 of most ages, especially as you get past the 30s and 40s, where a lot of your debts are tied up in things like student loans, and you don't have a lot of equity on your home. For people in their 50s, 60s, and 70s, about 2/3 of their net worth is their home. And so equity becomes a really big part of this. And it's actually a really big driver of how consumers behave. Example, research came out last year, showed that consumers in general, they were, when they felt richer because they had higher levels of equity in their home, they spent more often, they spent more money. And that powered some of our initial consumer boom in the post-COVID recession era, in that recovery period. And not only did we inject a lot of capital, but the increase in equity made people feel richer. They started spending a lot more money. The opposite is true, of course. When prices start coming down, people realize it, they feel a little poorer, but this doesn't work very evenly. We actually have something in behavioral finance that talks about this very concept. So right now, home prices haven't gone down enough to really inhibit people from feeling richer per se. And what do I mean by that? So one thing is there's this old adage we talk about. We often, think about the way you describe your winnings and losses. Let's say you bought a stock at $5 a share 2 years ago. A year ago, it went up to $20 a share. Oh my gosh, you made 4 times your money. But now it went down to $15 a share. Most people look at that and they say, my goodness, I'm still up from $5 2 years ago. I'm rich. And they won't look at the fact that, hey, a year ago, you technically should have sold that stock. You made a bad call on that and you've lost real money. People view it as something that isn't real money. They call it house money. I'm playing with I have paper losses, not real losses. And that's one of the other things that happen when we view real estate markets and how people behave. Not only do they become more confident when they win, but even when they start losing a little bit of their equity value, et cetera, it's not enough for them to feel poor, especially if they've already locked in some gains. And so that's why it's not changing a lot of our consumer behavior. People are still spend, even though the real estate market across the country is flat. Now look at the West in particular. Well, all of us here in the West looking at this, and especially California, up to Seattle, negative changes in home prices over the last 12 months. That has not spread to the rest of the country. Kansas, Iowa, other places with historic stock, not a lot of growth, didn't see the growth in the recession. They also didn't see the house decline. So we're coming off a lot of the gains we've seen. MB Braverman says, I don't get this. I saw recently that it's cheaper to rent than own in almost every market, especially San Francisco. Why is the home ownership rate so high? And that's a really good question. One of the things you have to look at, and you're absolutely right, how can anybody buy a home knowing how prohibitively expensive it is in many parts of the country? And so home ownership, of course, and one of the things are, of course, not only are we an aging society in that sense, average age of an American is about 38 right now. But when we think about where we're going, or where we plan to be with regards to the future, home ownership in much of the country still is I don't mean this, how should I say this way? Relatively affordable. When mortgage rates were very low, affordability went up for many Americans. 2/3 always seems high. And even in the San Francisco Bay Area, where it's lower than other parts of the country because of the prohibitively expensive price of real estate, it is due to the historical, think about it this way, the average person isn't a new home buyer. They've had a property often for decades. We have right now more retirees than we've ever had, and that ranges between 15 and 20% by state, about 60, 65 and over. Almost all of them within certain levels homeowners. And then you have people above the age of 45 and above that often own homes. And so you're driven in a situation where you're dealing with people who have had just the benefit of time and looking at all of that and making it work within those bounds. And what's the fundamental issue of the last 30 years has been a story of reduced home construction, greater growth than greater increases in demand over supply, and more unaffordable homes. And although we've been holding steady at the home ownership rate, I would suspect that, MV, to your point, that unless we change the paradigm around building new homes, our prices, this will be, home ownership rates will decline. And what I mean by that is we have to think about ways that people generate equity, be it in things like townhomes or other higher density units or other things that can be more affordable in districts that are prohibitive of people buying them. And also, of course, then you need access to capital. You have to ensure that first-time home buyers, other people have that information. Looking at this situation, I was just part of a report that we just talked about this in the state that I live in, which in New Mexico. And right now, the average savings of a New Mexican is about $15,000. Average price of a home in Albuquerque is cheap by any standard, about $325,000. But you still need to get that 5% down. You still need 16 grand to do so. And that's greater than the savings that most people have. And so the calculus often doesn't work in a very positive way. And property taxes aren't high enough, Colin. That's right. That's an interesting question too. That's a debate. They vary heavily from state to state. And one of the things that you talk about, especially in relationship to affordability, the question of property taxes is a significant one. Albert says the birth rate in the US and many advanced nations is about to dive, though. What will that do to the housing market? What will happen soon? This is really interesting. The demographic cliff, as it will affect a lot of aspects of our economy, not just the educational market, which is often described, things like everything from your K-12 education through college education, of course, looking at just fewer students to go around. How do you make that business work without raising costs is a fundamental question. You also have things like the birth rate not only just falling across the board, but also reduced population growth. In the long run, that increases, say, housing stock. Obviously, right now, you can go and find very affordable homes in places like Detroit or Cleveland or Great Lakes cities that have an excess of housing stock. It's suspecting, though, because this is the interesting part. This is the really weird part about how we can look at different future simulations on this. If we ignore the question, if people still want to work where there are jobs and activity. So let's say you're a software engineer, you're probably going to want to work in areas where a lot of other software engineers play. That's where the companies are located. There might be some in-person component, even part of your time is online. That's always going to make these cities desirable for these people to live in. And as a consequence, these cities will have an irrational amount of demand, even in a declining area. You'll see hotspots for real estate markets always in the country. But then you'll also see depressing areas. In many cases, rural populations in general have been struggling. They've been declining. That's excess housing stock, and that excess housing stock is either abandoned or it's improved. And you have to, and people move where there are jobs, and housing stock doesn't exist in all the places where they need to be. And so you could have many more homes in San Francisco, but you also need, but you could have many fewer homes in other parts of the country. So I think it's still not from the purposes of looking at this, and that's a really good question that you asked. Really, really good question. Because it's such a thing, Albert, because it's always going to cause economic hotspots to struggle with the question of finding affordable housing. But it will also increase for those people who are in a position of, hey, can I live in a rural area with little economic prospects because the real estate is available? I mean, there will be always also cheaper real estate in parts of the country, and it puts downward pressure on certain things. Good example is Japan. You can get very inexpensive rural Japanese real estate, even while cities like Tokyo end up being, very, very expensive. Aaron says in California, New York City, there's a special factors versus the rest of the US, jumbo products, stock option bonuses, mix of smaller dwellings, a lot of things you can do to increase. Look at the permits by Fed Metro area. That's really interesting. That's really cool. And so you're pointing this, Aaron points out, of course, hey, wait a second. Look at new private housing structures authorized by building permits for Oakland, Berkeley. Obviously, not a very impressive number here if I'm looking overall, especially considering the number of people who might want to live in the area. And building permits, at the end of the day, if I were to get rid of all the economic theory and boil it down into what would make housing more affordable in certain areas, you do have to provide more housing. And what that means is not just housing. When people think of housing, and this is the downside part, they say, oh, let's build apartments for people. Let's build these multifamily units that are dominated by the rental markets. That is useful in getting, roofs over people's heads. But I encourage also, the thing that really people need to develop is equity. They need equity, not only as a source of financial security and wealth, but that creates all kinds of positive long-term effects to their life. And so if you're building a multifamily structure, make sure they're sellable, they're equity units, they're condos, they're some association that does it, or you have density driven townhomes and other things. It's about equity. And that should be a right that most Americans should possess, is the ability and affordability to buy a house in an area in a market that can maintain them. And you will find it will be stressful. And indeed, we already know for a fact that the Bay Area suffers because of its high housing costs. You do not attract everyone that you could attract, even in the best jobs. And as a consequence, that is a cost. And people weigh that cost against other aesthetic features, personal desires, the ability of your HOA, whatever it is that you value. California has at least 5 to 10 million too few homes. Agreed, Aaron. California in particular. And you look at this, this is a great chart, actually. This is exactly what I'm talking about. So Aaron, thanks for harping on this with me, but alfred.stlouis.org/series, this last link that Aaron posted in the chat, look at that buildup of housing that's happened. And I'll copy it for the people in the cheap seats that are like listening, they're driving home, they're on the road, they're doing things, you're on you're trying to navigate traffic right now, please do so safely. But if we look at the number of homes, and I'll do a screenshot here, but I've got too many open windows to get a clear view. Let me bear with me for 1 second, and I'll do I like this St. Louis Fed add-in. But I'm going to post this here. I'll bring it up, post it here. So this is California building permits going back to the 90s. A lot of new properties built up through, the financial crisis, 2006, 2008. Since that time, we've never really recovered. There's been a lot more units created, a lot more households created, a lot more immigration demands. And California has not caught up. Prices have skyrocketed in accordance with that. Any thoughts on these businesses, including Westfield leaving downtown San Francisco too? Now, the commercial real estate market is a really fascinating one in general. So you look at cities like San Francisco, looking at this, the amount of vacancies in commercial office space, it is amazing to see, but also not unexpected. Thank you, Chris, for driving. I appreciate this. I will describe it to you. Thank you, Christopher Lee. I will describe it to you as a poem and a song. Imagine a chart with a very high number with a very high level of building permits that happened until 2006, falling off in the 2008 financial crisis and never really recovering and being kind of a smooth line that remains at less than half of its peak level in the 2000s. That's building permits in California. And I'll try to do so as thoroughly as I can. So knowing, of course, when you're driving out to where you hopefully have found more affordable housing. So obviously you're headed on your way, you're driving back to Fresno for several hours. One of the things that, don't text when you're driving, but this is a big deal. So Albert, back to your point, commercial real estate hasn't figured out the market yet. Right now, one of the big factors, we've got $300 million of commercial real estate loans. 70% of that is owned by small and mid-sized banks. That's coming due this year. Commercial real estate works like this. It's not mortgage real estate. It's not something where somebody pays a principal and interest at the same time. Commercial real estate, buying, say, a skyscraper or buying a pizza business, often works as an interest-only facility. You have 10 years. I will buy this property. I'll put in my pizza place or office building. I pay interest only for a number of years. 10 years ago, interest was low. And then suddenly it comes due. And my choices are I pay off the loan in full or I refinance at a higher rate. And so in addition to the general consensus about how commercial real estate works, businesses coming in, hiring workers, needing that office space, now businesses are cutting back on office space, both from work from home, pandemic related situations, but also because of this financial aspect. Rates are higher across the sector. They're at the mercy of these higher rates. And when these units revolve, they'll have to refinance and spend a lot more money for the same property. And so what do? They can either sell the property to someone else, they can figure out a different leasing arrangement or a different time frame. You're going to see a lot of questions around real estate across a lot of different markets. And San Francisco is one of them. And I expect this uncertainty will actually continue, Albert. The Silicon Valley Bank of retail apocalypses. If only they can change the zoning. Now make some of those units that are available to be sold and refurbished into, say, reasonably affordable starter apartments in the 250K to 400K range. Then you've got a range where you've got a solution to affordable housing that might work. But there isn't. It's never that easy. The 12 million. So one of the things, last 12 months, not 12 million. Last 12 months, what have been the home value changes in Western metros? Look at the most red right there in the Bay Area. Boom goes the dynamite. All around the Bay Area too, apart from a couple of things, if you lived on top of Mount Tam maybe, but a couple other things, they're generally pretty even about the decline. But because the run-up has been so severe, it's not enough to really make that final difference of whether you're going to buy that, $2.3 million home in Atherton or not. It's going to depend on, the market continuing to go down in this way, and also availability of additional real estate coming on. So, although in a negative light, this is not a positive sign for existing homeowners to see your equity be diminished. It is necessary, I think, across most Western metros to have some price correction to the run-up that we've seen, even with the very rational supply-demand issues that we've seen. So Aaron points out, San Francisco empty offices now spend 26 million square feet. And the rest of the Bay might be 35 plus million more square feet. Wow, what an extra 60 million square feet of empty space. That's like 2 IKEAs. No, just kidding. No, that's a lot of different properties, and that'll be really interesting. Albert, that's what I'm talking about. Convert that thing into housing. Speak to your zoning boards about how to make that happen. But that's going to be a hard role on this, is that you have a lot of, you're going to see commercial demand in particular take a hit. And I don't see a sunny way out of commercial real estate for the next few years, at least in most of these big downtown markets. Now, it's just too expensive to maintain. Aaron, you're right for a lot of reasons, not least from the regulatory standpoints, but also, of course, as much as I'd like to say convert it to housing, those are really expensive refurbs because you got to go in, and then obviously the standards that make a commercial real estate building a viable commercial real estate building aren't the same as the standards to make it something that you can live in, not least the availability and say of things like adding restrooms and certain amenities and other things to make it even more habitable. So it's going to be a bit of things, and that's the really hard part. And it will take it's taken the gut out of the commercial real estate market, and I think it will continue. There are some light sides that I think commercial real estate will continue to grow in up and coming markets. When I think about things like, there's probably avenues for alternative box stores, other things, stuff like this. But when we think about the big CRA office space things, other things, it's going to be a rough road. Even in town here, looking at things, I spoke with a manager of a large financial firm locally, and they're actually getting rid of their building because they've decided people can work from home, and they work from home well enough that they can avoid the cost of office space. So I think that's a decision people are making at the micro level all the time. All the time. So another thing I want to give a shout out, of course, to Sundar Ji and Substack. This is a cool site as well, a really interesting perspective of the residential real estate market. One reason that real estate prices aren't going down as much as you think they would is that this is the ratio of, this is the total amount of real estate debt that we have across the country, mortgages, a little bit over 8 trillion. Now it's above 10 trillion, almost 11 trillion. But look at the amount that are above 6%, 5 to 6%, 4 to 5%, 3 to 4, and below 3. During the pandemic, the amount of people with 3% mortgages, we're about $3 trillion of 3% mortgages floating around here. And we have an additional, what is that? About $5 trillion of 3 to 4% mortgages. That $8 trillion represents the majority of mortgages. Most people with a mortgage have a mortgage right now from up below 4%. They are not going to move. And because they're not going to move, those price adjustments aren't going to happen. Inventory will remain low, keeping prices artificially high in many markets. And you're not seeing the corrections we see in other markets. Over the long run, though, this is not sustainable as people build up equity and as people say natural demographic shifts. You can't continue on this road for 25 years, but you can certainly continue on this road for 5. And I think that's why one of the reasons we're not seeing a lot of change here. One of the things, few homes for sale, even during the busy spring season in 2023. Look at the inventory of listings. In 2023, it is just one solid amount of disappointment. If you're a real estate agent, or your friends are, or you know your friends who are, please reach out to them and see if they're doing okay. I know not everybody is. It's been a bummer of a situation to adjust based on the amount of activity they had in the last couple of years. But right now, the inventories are just lower, and it's very hard to look at this. And so how are people buying homes? And back to MV, back to your question previously about how are people doing this in this world? Looking at letting cash out of the bag, the amount of homes that are bought with cash, and I mean, is actually near its 9-year high. About 1/3 of all homes are bought entirely with cash. So, and some of that, and people are like, is it Blackstone, other things? I mean, that's some of it in the market is that side, but it's actually surprising. You look at other things. Some of them are people who have appreciated in their home in California. They sold it and they're living in a cheaper place and they're able to pay it with cash. Obviously large unmarked bills, $1 bills, just suitcases full of $1 bills. But you have a situation that's very unique. And if you notice how this graph goes, since 2011 is the left side of this graph, 2023 is the right side, you saw cyclicality in cash offers. You reached kind of this nadir in the height of the recession, not a lot of people buying homes with cash. And since that time, we've just seen the number of cash values explode. And a lot of that is driven by the combination of low inventories and mortgages that are just they're unappetizing for people. And so we're being driven by markets that have money, that are still buying and trading homes. And about one third of all homes are cash offers now. 0 for 4 on offers and so many lost to all cash. I know, exactly. Albert, just bring in, that's the really hard part. How do you negotiate something? How do you fight against this when you're looking at financing and doing this to the system? And it's a terrible thing because you get swooped out if you have the home swooped out from under you by somebody who just happens to be, really, really freaking well off. So it's a challenging situation. Colin, what do you think?
Are we also seeing more cash offers to avoid the high mortgage rates?
Oh, I think that's exactly what's happening. I think people are doing this. I think people who would have taken on a mortgage to supplement their cash are now saying, no, I'm not going to do this. I'll just, sell my gold-plated BMW and I'll buy this house in cash.
Cash is still king.
Cash in this market it is, which is people are, and this is really interesting. It is just a very bizarre real estate market because not only is our inventories low, it's the real estate market of the rich and for the rich right now. It's a tough market. My sympathies to you out there, those people looking for homes, looking at trying to figure out when is this going to go down. And so our hope is, of course, if the Fed does pause and if the Fed were even to extend, if inflation were to get under control sooner than expected, obviously we would hope the Fed would start lowering rates. That would then have an effect on the rest of the economy to lower this and maybe get some of those homes sold again. But as long as mortgage rates remain like they do, it's going to be really unappetizing. Again, look at those dark blue lines there, all those cheap mortgages in the system. Those are people who want to hold on to their house. And even this, and I'm looking at this, I have a house that is a really low mortgage rate because I got lucky, but I'm also like, I don't even every option if I'm like, Riley, move over here and, fulfill your dream and work at Cal State Chico or something. I don't know. And it's one of those things where you end up in a situation where you don't want to give it up because it is such a good deal in the long run. And it is a barrier to real estate adjustment and the real estate price adjustment, because the real estate market would have to fall significantly more to be equivalent to the prices that we saw at the 3% level. We'd actually have to lose about 20% more in price to get us back to a more affordable real estate market that's commensurate with the mortgage rates that we saw before the run-up. Oh, man. So what are we talking about? So we got this happening. We also have got this happening. Output growth and output for our work. Another thing to think about when we think about all these things about where the economy is going. So one of the sources of economic growth can be population growth. The other can be productivity growth, making more things with less. Think Adam Smith writing in The Wealth of Nations and talking about this. On like the first couple pages, he talks about the benefits of the Industrial Revolution in manufacturing, how by separating tasks, something like producing a pin, which took, people can make a few of these in one day. With a dedicated team of specialists, you can make thousands of pins a day. Productivity creates wealth generation, creates economic growth and all those things. The United States, after the World War II, our productivity growth was good. It was solid, but Germany and Japan's was much more so. One of the reasons the United States and the Bretton Woods Agreement set the dollar convertible to gold, and all other currencies had to pass through the dollar at a fixed rate. It had some benefits, and one of those benefits were that it helped rebuild the German and Japanese markets after the war. It subsidized effectively their economic growth. Productivity soared in those countries. After 1973, of course, Bretton Woods was abandoned. We entered a free-floating currency stage. Productivity growth in Japan and Germany was still high. The United States, benefiting from the technology revolution, 2000s, our productivity growth exceeded other Western nations. That led to greater increases in wealth, greater increases in our economy. But since then, our productivity growth has declined substantially. So when we think about the question, and this goes back to what we discussed last time involving AI, is that even when you think about things like productivity as a function of economic growth, the question of whether AI will be a positive or negative effect in the economy will be determined on its ability to be utilized as a productivity increasing force. And that is the ultimate case. Can it produce more stuff for us in a way that we can capitalize and translate into economic growth? Some quick notes, other ways across the board. banking industry right now. Just a quick update on them. So the deposit flight that we saw in the first couple months of the year, and actually over the last year, because rates have gone up so much, a lot of people don't want to leave their money in checking accounts in banks, and banks have suffered as a consequence. Some banks, Silicon Valley Bank, more than others. But another example would be just your casual mid-level bank not messing around or operating normally with a normal group of generally FDI insured people. They're still suffering in the sense that it's harder to get deposits for them. These banks are often the engine of economic growth, and as deposits decrease, it makes it harder for them to increase loans. And so a lot of banks start cutting back. And that's what I expect we'll see in the next couple months. And the level of that we've seen in the last couple months will dictate whether or not we'll actually get into a recession in 6 months. But deposits are going down, but deposits growth has since leveled off. It's not going down anymore. But the other thing is people are putting more money into this red line, which are these CDs. And CDs as a whole and money market accounts don't pay the banks good margins. And as a consequence, that also further, even though deposit growth might be okay, it also creates kind of a downward pressure on their ability to lend. And so things to think about going forward. Internationally, oh, fun, this is cool. Albert, I want to catch up too. But even if you try to get an FHA loan through sellers, generally want the guarantee with cash. We saw layoffs covered by AI for the first time last month by a Challenger Grain Christmas report. You're right. I expect this to increase. I think so too. And I think actually, you know, we think about the question of what is AI? Is AI really doing this, or are companies really doing this as an excuse to get rid of employees? I think AI will accelerate some things we've seen already in the system. And so I think that companies who are already on the fence or looking at the reduction in changes in their workforce will likely do so. And that might play out this year. There are certain things that we'll have to observe. Oh, fun. This is fun. Conference Board Economic Database. Aaron's just dropping the links. Love it. UK. So the UK, of course, I want to do a quick thing internationally real quick. One thing that's relevant, these are graphs from Joseph Politano, another cool person to follow if you're looking at Twitter and other places. UK stagnation. So right now, the United States recovered better than the EU did. We pumped more money into our economy than other countries after the COVID recession. The UK did not do as well. And in fact, right now, they still remain smaller than they were pre-COVID. And they basically stagnated. Some of that is due, of course, to certain economic decisions related around their decision to leave the common market that had costs associated with it, with the EU, but also there's other issues at home. And one thing that's affecting the UK is still, they also maintain a housing shortage that's often very similar to what we've seen across the world, especially in other countries like Canada and other places that have seen rapid increases in the price of real estate. The United Kingdom actually built fewer homes, even though it has a population 3 times bigger than Florida did in the last year. And the interesting part is that, and this is one of those well thought out restrictions, it really comes down to your ability to build houses to match that supply and demand issue. And people will compete for housing, they'll spend more money for housing, but if you don't have housing available, those prices increase to the detriment of the local population. And that has some negative effects that also make this stagnation for the UK even worse. So I want to talk a little bit about this. Oh yes, Albert says UK recession, EU recession is coming to a market near you. That's actually a very good concern. Albert asked me earlier in this, right before we were talking, would a EU recession produce a contagion that would result in a US recession? And I think that while it wouldn't, it depends on the nature of the recession. Absolutely a contagion is possible depending on what failed or the nature of the recession. But because all of our markets are intrinsically tied together and the EU is a very large trading partner, a loss in our sort of economic and the economic growth or economic decline in a trading partner would result in negative economic consequences for us in the way that our 2008 Great Recession adversely affected the economies around the world. We typically are often the fire that starts the global apocalypse. And everywhere was engaged, everywhere had a recession, or most large countries did, in the years following 2008, over which was originally a US mortgage-based crisis. And it is amazing to see how it flows through a system. I will say that our banking system is different than the EU's. EU's banking system is a little bit more vulnerable because they didn't have the reckoning we did in 08. They were affected by it, but they didn't have the mass recapitalization that we did. But it will make some things untenable. And the nature of what happens will be very interesting in the coming months. Very good question. So anyway, So let's finish off today with a couple of little things that I want to talk about. We just did a interesting, fascinating, and dangerous dance with the debt ceiling. And I'm glad we reached a conclusion that didn't result in a default. But I want to address this a little bit. And I know you've heard a lot about this. You probably just forgot about this for 2 weeks now. Now that we've had this, you said, I'm so glad we're not talking about the debt ceiling. And then I'm bringing it up again. I'm like, I'm like the conversation partner. I'm like a voice from your past just coming in, and I'm going to bring up stuff. I'm not going to, let's talk about what you didn't want to talk about. Do you remember 5th grade? I remember. But one of those things, let's talk a little bit about what a default would look like in the United States, why we need to care about this, and why our existing system is kind of dumb with regards to certain things. The US has an interesting separation, as you know, sharing a unique characteristic with us and Denmark globally, where we separate the legislation that authorizes spending in a budget with the actual legislation that increases our debt limit, meaning that we're allowing ourselves to spend what we've already authorized separately. It's fascinating. And we know, of course, you've read enough about this, maybe. This is an artifact of the US system dating back to World War I. Before World War I, the United States Congress would authorize every issuance of debt that we had. When wars happen, we have to issue a lot of debt. And Congress said, let's just make a ceiling for debt. And so that was a way they could hopefully enter into a period of fiscal control. Normally, increasing the debt ceiling was sort of par for the course. It was understood that it ties directly into the budget, a non-controversial issue, until shenanigans that began in 2011, 2012, and then repeated over a number of couple of years, where we looked at the question of the debt ceiling, and now it's being utilized as a political weapon. So what would be, if we actually defaulted, what would it look like? And I first want to address the question that, and this is a question that Colin had, and he asked me to present about this today. But, this is a really good question. And I will honestly admit, because it hasn't happened before, the nature of how it would happen and the nature of what would happen would be unpredictable. But we have enough tells that enough evidence out there that we can predict the approximation of what would happen. And perhaps the best example of this going back is back in 1979. We actually had a technical default on about $100 million of debt, just one tranche of US debt. And it was based off of a computer glitch. It was an accident. It's actually not formally considered a default. But because a payment was inadvertently delayed, that increased the cost of the debt that we had across our entire system. And when we looked at Brookings estimates overall, that this cost us about $40 billion of additional debt costs on a $100 million default. And what do those additional debt costs look like? They look like higher rates that we have to pay. So when we default accidentally, or we pretend to default, that increases the cost of our debt, making it more expensive for us to issue debt. And unfortunately, because we have so much debt, that would have a really big effect on our economy. We have some ideas about what would happen. So the first is that in an ordinary time period, government expenditures come in at sometimes predictable rates and less predictable times in other places. And the reason that even Janet Yellen was like, when are we going to run out of money? She first said July, and maybe it's June 1st. There's a lot of things that are unpredictable. So one of them is that revenues come in at different rates. We know in April, we get a lot of tax revenue. Okay, we know that tax revenue is collected throughout the year. We know the government has to give out a certain amount of refunds throughout the year. We also know that things like when people recognize capital gains and capital losses, these are unpredictable. And so we have these uncertain streams of revenue that are built in. So government expenditures in a default would come due, but incoming tax revenues are insufficient. We've got around this through extraordinary measures since January. And if we didn't agree to something in a couple of weeks ago, we would have been exhausted. We would have exhausted it this month. So the government can't prioritize, say, Medicare or social payments or government payments, one payments over another. They all come due at different times. Tax revenue comes due, that's how much we have in our coffers. That can go out depending on it. So more likely what would happen is you'd end up in a situation where we would have insufficient funds to pay all of debt holders or all of Social Security payment owners. And that would be a phenomenally challenging thing to endure. And the result of this, and I don't want to say this in uncertain terms, and because is that, we looked at prioritization was discussed. We don't have prioritization because it's hard to do so, and the legal avenues to do so are very difficult. Are there other ways we could get around it? We've weighed on things like the $1 trillion coin idea. We mint a coin and we make it happen. Would that be inflationary? The big picture is, and this is one of the most interesting things, was that there was this other take on this, was that, and of all the fascinating things I've read and all the fascinating takes I've read, one of the most interesting ones was that, hey, we're the United States and we can't default. And some people pointed to the 14th Amendment and said we have to honor all debts. Some people have, pointed to other things and said, oh, we'll just print more money. Why would we have to default? And it doesn't work that way. And there's two reasons why. One is that I can't feed you if my cupboards are bare. So as much as I might deny the fact that I have no food, if I'm not authorized to spend money within the system, I can deny the fact that I'm not feeding you. But I'm still physically not taking things out of the cupboard. I don't have food to give you. I don't have payments to happen. It's not the Egyptian rule where we're in denial. It is a thing where we're ending in a situation where we don't have enough money to pay. The big thing that most people misunderstood about this, I think, in looking at these takes, was that it's the perception that matters more than the actual fulfilling that bargain. And the perception that we were no longer creditworthy has adverse consequences. The question is not, oh, can we pretend to get out of this, or can we pay it with some gimmick or something else? The question is whether the US can honor the debts that they've already incurred. And defaulting would end the days of the cheap and easy credit that we rely on. Prohibition on defaulting as a whole is a meaningless juncture because the markets wouldn't buy it. It's not like my financial advisor or my market manager or somebody who's an asset manager will say, oh, yes, I'm going to hold a lot of US debt at this very low rate because I understand, wink, wink, that when you don't pay me, it still means you're solvent. It doesn't work that way. Financial markets respond in very rational ways. And it's likely that asset managers overall are going to demand one of two things. Either you pay me more interest on this debt because you're risky, or I'm going to find other effectively default risk-free options across the world. I'll go buy some other bond from some other country. I'll find another financial instrument, but I'm not going to buy your debt. That's a negative consequence. Right now, we spend between 6 and 10% in a given year of our government expenditures on servicing our debt. It would go up drastically if we had a default. It would make our expenses on debt increase across the board for years to come. And it would also result in job losses. And what do I mean by this? And so here's an estimate from the White House Council of Economic Advisors. And looking at the question of brinkmanship, the brinkmanship we just had has a cost to it because it increases our cost of debt right now. But the job growth is small, about 200,000 losses, maybe a 0.3% hit to the GDP. If we defaulted for a day, and the markets went a little crazy, government got together and said, oh, let's fix this, probably 500,000 jobs, maybe 0.5% of GDP growth. If it was protracted, if we were defaulted for a month, 2 months, and it didn't seem like we could come to an agreement, then we're looking at 8 million jobs and 6% GDP growth, an entirely self-inflicted wound. And I'm not saying this to remind you, to scare you about the future events, but of all the things to play with for dumb reasons, this is one of them. But I guess the story of hope is I'm not coming out against government inefficiencies in any way, or the ability that we should continue to spend a lot more than we have. Two sides of the equation, revenues and expenses. We do have to figure out a way to make this happen. Excessive amounts of debt of any kind are a drag on the economy. But the reason is the United States maintains a privileged position in the world economy. We can maintain 100% GDP in debt. We probably can maintain 200% GDP in debt and still achieve cheap debt because of our perception as a safe economy. The difference between Greece with its brinkmanship, default, and other scenarios that happened where they had all these emergency situations 10 years ago when it was running at 125% debt to GDP. Versus Japan, which has 250% debt to GDP. Japan still gets cheap debt because net exporter, perceived as a safe haven, fiscally responsible. Greece was perceived as not being those things. The US is still perceived as being a fiscally responsible place with the rule of law to put money in. And if you lose that or damage that reputation, that cost will not only have the cost of increased debt expenses, but it will no longer enable us to maintain a high debt load without catastrophic consequences in the long run. So we do have to get our fiscal house in order. And there's a lot of things that we have to do to maintain that. The US dollar is no longer the reserve currency. Albert, you're absolutely right. Until the US dollar is no longer, the fact that the US dollar is in 2023, 78 years after the end of World War II, the dominant world currency. Indeed, still, even with all the talk of de-dollarization, about 80% of all currency transactions involve the dollar as one of those two currencies. That is a phenomenal coup that benefits us incredibly in the long run. And it would, of course, if we think about this, de-dollarization, and we had a talk about this a couple months ago, not happening to the effect that we think it is, or it seems to be, but it is something over the long run. If I'm making a bet, of course, other countries, greater economic activity, not only just China, India, other places, there are countries not reliant on the dollar or not using the dollar as much or looking at alternatives. That does create a tendency towards de-dollarization in the long run. But again, we're still preserved as a de facto global currency as long as we maintain the rights and privileges therein, which means keeping fiscal responsibility at the utmost of our levels. And we have the US military, but the US military expenditures are ridiculous. I mean, we have absurdly expensive things. And one of the questions that we don't solve, and I do a lot of work with here, the national labs, you've got Sandia and Lanel and those other folks, and we do a lot of stuff out there. You have Sandia, of course, Sandia, which is headquartered here in Albuquerque, but also has our area up in near Livermore. We have serious problems in the way that we manage, or the thoughts around managing government money from a fiscal situation and a sustainable situation is. And we do have to have serious talks that we aren't having about how to become more fiscally aware. So anyway, it's a really, really interesting question. I will get really, I've learned a lot about having worked in these categories, and I've seen such fascinating things. One year, I was speaking with a business manager at the Department of Energy, and they had an excess amount. They were more efficient that year than they were supposed to be, and they had all this money at the end of the fiscal year. It ends on September 30th, and they had a choice, and they said, well, we can't give it back because that means we would get a lower allocation of funds from the government the next year. So they spent it on stuff they didn't need. They spent it on like a bunch of chairs, other things. And it was just, these decisions that happen at the margins are really heartbreaking. So I think in the long run, we do have to really, really look at a serious question about fiscal accountability across our boards. And one of the things that we like to throw money at something, but we don't necessarily look at, say, the ROI of that, the return on our investment, or what necessarily might be the best outcome for that, not only from a stance of what is the best defense infrastructure, but also things like localized. What is the best educational investment that we can make for students, other things. And we got to have some serious talks that we would have to really change drastically. Aaron says, then we go back to the 30s and 40s economy, global debt markets drive it. The dollar will stay this way. One of the reasons I wanted to issue 25, 50, 75-year T-bonds is they would have pushed long rates lower in our term structure of $30 trillion debt. That's true. Long treasury bonds would be a really interesting thing. 120,000, watch those shenanigans. This is a good. So Aaron and Albert, a good discussion there too, but also looking at the question of, what is the long-term effect of this? So the answer in fixing a financial crisis isn't brinkmanship around the debt ceiling. The answer is fiscal accountability and also increasing your revenues. It's a two-sided equation, not just the costs, but also you have to show good faith and spend money wisely and practically. And we have to be really thoughtful about what that means. So lastly, on the deck, we have some quick observations from San Francisco and San Jose in the last jobs report. Good news is unemployment ticked down in both areas, 3.1% in San Fran and 3.0 in San Jose. Notice that there's a month delay, of course, in the metropolitan area data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So the most recent data, of course, is April. Some things to note, there are fewer unemployed people in San Francisco and San Jose. That's good. But we're also losing the labor force. So we're seeing some drop off in some labor force. to the tune of about 31,000 in San Francisco and about 16,000 in San Jose. And that's a significant drop. People leaving the labor force, are they moving? Are they leaving? Are they finding that the market's too hard to adapt? Are they with a partner and you're living off of one person's salary? Or that's a very, very good question. And we don't know fully yet the nature of this or whether this represents a 1 month trend or a fluke. Across the board, information sector remains dropped about another 1,000 jobs in San Francisco, but the information sector lost another 1,500 jobs in San Jose, kind of with the rest of the country when we compare it to the last 12 months. In San Jose in particular, there are fewer people employed in information and financial activities than there were the previous year, which is kind of driving on those data that we've already seen. But I'm pleased to note that professional and business services are holding up, government employment is holding up. And a lot of the trade growth, the growth in trade and transportation, that infrastructure to which the Bay Area represents a natural affinity, especially in our Trans-Pacific partnerships. Looking at this, they are seeing some solid growth, even though they've leveled off. That decline that we saw in trade and transportation during the winter season has leveled off, which is encouraging. So that's the good sign. Other things happening though. Grubhub, uncut 15% today. Yikes. That's more bad news bears. And Collins says the US government gave out too much stimulus checks and nobody wants to work anymore. I love Collins' sardonic replies into the situation. We know, of course, there isn't any, the good news is, as much as you'd be like, I know the people who are like, we know Colin's joking, but then they're like, what if he's telling the truth? There isn't a lot of data. We actually did study that. There isn't a lot of data that people have reduced their ability to work because of government checks that ran out. A good example was we had the data coming. We knew that the number of states offering those checks declined. Some states got rid of them first. We didn't see return to the labor market. The biggest factor is, of course, demographics, people getting older, people wanting to retire and not coming back in the workforce. And also there are fewer, we've also had this drive downwards, and we're missing some jobs in some sectors. We've had a decline in immigration that began in 2017, recovered a little bit in the last couple of years, but it's having an effect on our bottom line and creating labor shortages in some sectors in particular. Oh, man. Oh, Aaron, thank you so much. This is really good. I am so grateful. Man, that's great. Let's add it all. Let's do downward things. Aaron, you are the best. I appreciate this so much. Thanks for hanging on, everybody that hung on here. But Aaron, that you rock as always. We're so grateful to be here in front of you. Let's take it down the west. We'll go to Fresno, to the Central Valley first. We'll go to Stockton. We'll hit up Modesto. All the high markets where people are moving to find quasi-affordable homes. Collins says whoever can stretch 2.4K into 2 years should be my financial planner. Albert, so with all this info, what's your advice for job seekers in the next few months? Feel like we're in an economic holding pattern. We absolutely are. This is tricky. Again, if I look at the aggregate data, this is a calm period. We've got some positive numbers on the board. We've got some things leveling out that should level out. We've got some stableness. And even right now, if I look at, even though our savings rate is lower, our aggregate savings are still higher than before the recession. We've got a little bit of a cushion. I think we might be able to push off our downward recession. I thought maybe the end of the year, it would be potentially next year. That is my hope. I'm still optimistic more than I was before in a soft landing. Variables that could change that tune. You've got the Europe situation, what's happening with the economy over there. We've got some variables hitting the market across not only what the Fed will do tomorrow and in the future involving rate increases, but looking at ways that municipalities, communities respond to high housing prices, availability of real estate, and looking for avenues to help people coming online to build and develop home ownership for long-term fiscal success. Also, commercial real estate, not very positive about that market. Will it affect more banks in the future? And the answer is most certainly yes. So a lot of good questions. I think we have a recession coming, but maybe we can delay it. One thing about all this is we can hopefully delay it 6 months and make it minor. And that's my hope. So thank you guys. This is good. Tour to Las Vegas. Blackjack tables. I don't engage much in financial situations where where I have negative expected returns, but I will always be down with it. I always like a good haggle. The stretch session. Aaron, I love it so much. I'm going to say that everywhere. Is anybody else? What questions do you have? Anything else that I missed? Anything you want to talk about?
So I was looking at the data with Albert last week, and the 2008 recession, apparently the Fed saw it in 2007, and then they paused the rate hiking, and then 2008 happened. So our recession, are recessions like something where you want to rip off the Band-Aid as fast as possible, or it gets worse the longer you delay it?
The best part, Colin, about that question is every time we've tried to fix the economy using this, every time we shoot too far and end up in a recession because we increase rates. To your point, shot rates up 2006, 2007. That recession was delayed. We're good at delaying recessions. Recessions are an inevitable part of the economic cycle. And I think that in the absence of COVID-19 happening, we had enough things that we wouldn't have had the stimulus. We may have still ended up in a recession, although placed differently, 2021, 20 something around that period, if we didn't have COVID-19. But to your point, we are not very good at this management, but we're trying to be. This could be the first time, Colin, where we're able to do it successfully. But I guess I'm not optimistic that we're able to because of this elephant in the room, inverted yield curve, negative forward economic indicators, still very strongly negative. And then we also have a very complex, we're basically right now we're exhausting our collective consumer savings. And that runs out with time unless we're able to effectively generate additional means of growth. We have drags in our economy that produce these things, and real estate is going to be one of them that will be that's going to be tough to shake out in the next couple of years. So I think we can delay it, but it will happen. Will we hit 2% inflation soon? I'm still betting on 2025 at the 2% level. I think we're going to have some variable until then without a recession. If we have a recession, we'll get it in a year.
Yeah, but my question was, recession is something where it's easier to deal with if you rip the Band-Aid off fast.
Oh, yeah.
If
you say rip the Band-Aid off, what do you mean? Like, are you saying like if I just raise rates to 20% and called it a day?
Yeah, give us the Volcker shock,
No, this is hard. So as you found out, so this is a pretty fast rip off of a Band-Aid in some ways. So to your point, we increase rates faster than we've done in 40 years with this situation right now. And what was the result? We actually got, and your point, and there's two ways you can look at this. One is like, clearly it wasn't enough because people haven't really changed their habits. But the other thing is that rates increase so fast that the time it takes for people to digest the economic situation at hand hasn't fully kicked in. So people looking at this saying, and that's why people are holding on to their mortgages. They don't need to sell them. They don't need to operate in this space. So people have a way of, the economy being composed of people has a way of forging its own path, regardless of whether you raise it to 20% or lowered it to 10%. I think it's probably somewhere in between, but I don't know. If you had to raise it, you'd have all these other negative externalities. Markets would freak out. And because markets would freak out, your risk of contagion increases drastically. And so the Fed wants to push, but they don't want to freak out markets too much because then you're dealing with the markets have amazing effects on how businesses operate, how banks operate, and how capital flows in the system. And so my fear is that it would be terrifying. I love this. This is like Andor Star Wars, the war of aggregate demand versus inverted yield curves. Oh, I love it. Albert, on the other hand, it is like 1982 again. You know, we have Indiana Jones movie coming out at the end of the month. We're missing our 13% interest rate. Thing about 82, though, is that we had a recession in 82. And the hard part about this is we don't have one yet. People are like, well, the market's going up a little bit. We've never bottomed out in the market before a recession. I made my students crunch those numbers just to double check. Aaron says we have a terminal rate at 5 to 6%, which could be our new normal as we have massive velocity of demand turnover. Maybe that's true. The question is, if we maintain this over the long run, could this be enough? If you go from one rate paradigm to another rate paradigm, is that enough to gradually slide the economy back to where we want it to be? And that, I don't know. We'd have never done it before. So we're going to see what happens this way. And this is a good question. We're in new territory. So your guess is as good as mine, Colin. So I like it. I like the Mo theory of greater, more pain, less problems sort of thing. I like that. Like, how would you debate this? If you were running this over and saying, let's rip the Band-Aid off, I fear that it would create, my worry would be that we'd have a liquidity crisis. We have a greater liquidity crisis than we would have. But maybe it's, I like.
Not my area of expertise, but.
Well, I'll still support you for your Federal Reserve chair, adding.
I guess like closing words, like the things that my main takeaways from this session were high quit rates, but major shift of jobs from high paying to more, I guess, low paying, but and high mortgage rates, record profits. I don't think we covered that, actually.
We didn't cover that. We didn't cover profits. We didn't cover profits.
Record revenues, but decreasing profits was the headline this morning, I think, that Albert and I were talking about.
That's right. And so this is that's right. So decreasing profits, but revenues. Yeah, this is true. Yeah. Aggregate consumer expenditures. Looking at, we are 2/3 of our economy's consumer spending. That has been holding pretty well. Downside is, of course, expenses have increased. Companies are seeing this. And this is interesting because, to your point, Colin, it's showing that companies are feeling this. If this is protracted, that creates layoffs as they reduce expenses. And so that's the interesting phenomenon. Steady rates, lower profits. Investors, they look for cost-setting measures. Then you end up in the Grubhub situations where you're cutting 5%, 10% here. And that would have an effect. And effectively, if enough companies did that, that would spiral us into a position of what is effectively a recession. If unemployment went up to 5%, that would be such an increase over where we are now in certain respects. I would say that is a recessionary or negative economy. So MV, Braverman says, are quit rates tied to return to work requirements? What an interesting question. What an interesting question that is. So quit rates tied to return to work requirements. Oh man, I would have to double check the research on that to give you a good question on that. So I see where you're going with that question, looking at return to work. So I'm not fully aware of the direct connection between them, but I can imply an indirect one. I would say right now, looking at quit rates superficially, we can say that people quit their jobs because they're looking at, everyone operates within their own calculus. And we've looked at quit rates is kind of the same, but not always the same, or symptomatic of people's confidence in the job market. It's a default rate. But let me get some older data, because that's such a really interesting question. So going back all the way to the dawn of time where we had economic data, the dawn of time in this case was 2000. But quit rates right now are about where they were in 2000. In recessions, quit rates drop drastically. So let's make a few observations. So 2008 recession, quit rates fell from around 2% down to about 1%. That doesn't sound like a lot, but that means people were like, hey, I have a job. I'm going to keep it because I'm really worried. On the other side of it, they increase in times of economic progress when people feel like they have a choice. So it might have an effect, but I don't know the magnitude of that effect. Aaron, that's a great question. Aaron says, we look like Japan 2007, 2010 when they raised rates to juice. I'm absolutely right about this. Japan has always had an interesting effect. One of the things that they've done because of their exchange rate, interesting part, because Japan is a net exporter, that increases the value of the yen relative to other currencies, which often, in the long run, we look at that makes their exports less competitive. Their yen becomes more valuable. It's more expensive. People find Japanese products more expensive. And so what happens is they want to buy less of them. But Japan wanted to intervene to help also increase their exports and also boost their economy. So they embarked at a very activist central bank that would go in and they'd release, they do a lot of things to reduce the value of the yen. And what would happen is the yen would go down in value and money flooded the system, and then it would go up again in like a month. And it would be like these little V's as Japan tried to manage it, because they were trying to really push their export too. Albert says, if the Fed lowers rates in the next few months, does that mean that companies could start hiring again? That's interesting, because all of the effects are delayed. I wouldn't say if the Fed switched in, let's say they lowered it 0.25%, not this time, but the next time. Let's say next session afterwards, they lowered 0.25%. They would lower it gradually unless we were in an economic recession. And even if they were lowering it gradually, it wouldn't be enough to turn the economics of this around, because so much of it happened so quickly. We haven't actually fully absorbed the effects of higher rates right now in the system. Because right now, all that increased debt costs with the consumer loans that are being refinanced, commercial real estate and related loans that are being refinanced, all that other stuff, that hasn't worked its way through the system yet. So it would have to be a really big decrease. Return to office. I see. Return to office requirements. That's thank you, MV. That makes more sense. Thank you. I was thinking in my head back to, I liked it. I'm like, my goodness, that's an interesting thing. So quit rates, I bet you, are related to return to office, although I would expect that obviously if people are quitting jobs and negotiating other jobs with more flexible work arrangements, we'd see that. I would expect to see almost the inverse, because I don't know, this is the hard part. We don't census this, so I don't have data on this. But if we notice that a lot of companies have recently become well known for saying it's time to get back to work, and one of those things. And then we had a few of those last year, but now in the last few months, we've seen a lot of these companies. A lot of financial firms are like, this has been fun, but back to work every day. And so as a consequence, we've got these people saying, no, I'm not going to take this anymore and I will quit. But we're not seeing that. Quit rates are still declining. But I wonder if that's still not a factor. I'm not saying it's not a factor, but it doesn't appear in the data yet that same way. But I'm interested in this. Albert says investors are addicted to the post-layoff juicing of the market too. NASDAQ is up 30% since January. Absolutely. Working remote is evil, immoral. That's a good question. We do have to work on long-run productivity in the country, though. Our productivity has kind of flatlined since the beginning of COVID. I don't blame remote work for that, but I think that some companies do. But it's an interesting part of this. This is a fascinating time to be alive. But my hope is that I suspect some version of work from home is going to be the same, if only because companies are getting rid of their office space and they can't house those workers anywhere, and you got to work from home. So things to think about as the future. I don't represent the billionaires. No, I'm working from home right now. I work from home today. And I let, do as I say, not as I do. One of those. The first billion is always the hardest. As I drink it's like a generic brand. It's not even real La Croix. That's fun. Aaron dropping all the cool links. What else we got? But Colin's right. So Colin for Fed Chair, Albert for Wells Fargo President and CEO. You heard it here first.
Oh yeah, that's a good question. What is the outlook for college grads that are graduating this month? Like they're gonna graduate, they're probably trying to look for a job. It takes like 3 to 6 months to probably find your first job. I assume my first job took a while, and that was in 2017.
Yeah,
long time ago. So they're graduating into a ChatGPT and potential recession period. What does this look like?
Okay, this is a good question. So right now, the facts of the thing is it's not as good as it was. One reason is the sectors that college graduates are graduating into aren't hiring en masse, and they aren't hiring well. And so financial sector, flat across the board. Information, declining a little bit. And so bang, you have like two of our factors. We're information and cybersecurity graduates. We have our MBAs. We've got all these people in these high-paying jobs. The market is there. There's enough sufficient churn demographically within companies to hire people whose positions are missed, but we're not seeing that growth rate. And I will tell you, absolutely, it is true that this market, well, last year was stellar for our market, and everybody got jobs and everyone was sunshine, rainbows, and thank yous. This particular market is harder. Our students from UNM doing okay. This is very good. I can't speak. Our students are the most excellent. West of the Pecos, but east of Yuma. But one thing that, but it is going to be harder for graduates, and it's harder for graduates going forward because we doing a few things are happening. Not only are these sectors not hiring in mass high levels of higher paying jobs, but companies are looking at questions like contract work, other things more common. I've had more students this year accept contract work over traditional employment that offered security and health benefits than I've seen in actually some time. And I suspect that will be a phenomenon that we see more of. Aaron says, I propose a new Federal Reserve Bank branch, which I want to run in Hawaii. I know. Let's cut it up. We've had 12 districts for too long, Aaron says. Let's make Hawaii. Let's also do the same irrational thing where the entire West is one district. And then let's make Hawaii its own. Bam. Pick a nice place, make it happen. Dr. Wright to launch into a spiel about UNM's pedagogical approach and its application in the world. I'm working on it. All those you, if you do attend these sessions, I can't offer, it's a 0% tuition discount, but I will, if you are interested in an online MBA, we do have many programs. But you get what you pay for. We're low, we're cheaper than a lot of California colleges, but that's good. So we do have that going for us. 56% of hiring managers plan to hire new college grads. How are you supposed to read this? Because right now, 50, so half of you are going to hire a new graduate. It's up from 51% of last year. That's good. So Aaron providing contrary evidence to suggest it's good. I like to read stuff like this. That's good. Planning on hiring isn't the same as hiring. Sometimes I think they plan on hiring and then they try to lowball the students so they get lower wages. And then, there's a lot of reasons they might be interested in this. But again, I'm interested in the fact that it's these contract work, C-suite executives, 11% mid-level positions. Interesting. So 11% are hiring new college graduates for C-suite executive positions. That's amazing. Maybe my freshman student who's applying for CEO positions has been right all along. Maybe that type of irrational overconfidence is, well, egg on my face.
Wow.
Cool. Good link, Aaron. So that's good. That is a good sign. But we saw it was a tougher market this year in my neck of the woods than we saw last year. But I'm happy. Could be because we're a small state though. We're like, you can fit everybody comfortably into Berkeley in New Mexico.
All right, we are 13 minutes over time. I feel like we should save some for next time. Next time, I guess maybe there's going to be more data on whether or not return to office is affecting quit rates.
Here we go.
We'll know more about the rate hikes. We'll know more about the jobs market and profits and revenues. We'll cover that next month.
Yeah, write it all down, Colin. Pop me an email and I'll put it in.
I'll pop it. So everybody who stayed till the end, thank you for coming. We enjoy having you here, giving us your questions. I personally learned a lot more about this quit rate thing that I wasn't aware of. And I hope that this helps you feel more confident in your job search or negotiating stock or better compensation prices. This was recorded and will be put online within 7 business days, and we all hope to see you next month.
Thanks, Colin. Thanks, everyone. Thanks.